Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Our newest champion, Hwei, has been revealed, and oh boy, is this another 200 years champion. I'm actually kind of excited about Hwei. I do think that he has a very interesting kit that I think is going to be a lot of fun to play with, but this is not going to be the kind of champion that you are going to learn on your first time playing him. This is not the kind of champion you're going to learn on the first 2 times playing him, or 12. This is the kind of champion who will be very good if you commit a lot of time into him. I think he has a very interesting kit where I intend for him to play the support position as well. We'll see. I think he's probably better in the mid lane overall, but let's go ahead and take a look at his abilities in this on this update page, which will of course be linked in the description if you want to follow along with me. Hwei's passive is the signature of the Visionary. He marks enemy champions with his with spells by first damaging them with his abilities. If he hits them with 2 damage-dealing spells, it places a signature on the ground beneath them, which detonates after a short delay to deal magic damage to all enemies in range. This is basically just a way for Riot to say you want to be weaving your abilities together. As much fun as it would be to just spam the same thing over and over again, you want to be using multiple different abilities in order to actually trigger this additional mark of damage. This also means that you have natural synergy with things like Electrocute, because as long as you're getting the 3 damage marks, you trigger Electrocute, then you're triggering the bonus damage on the mark. My assumption is that this mark is avoidable, that it's not automatically, like, you just take it if you stand there. I don't think it sticks to you. I think you have to stay in the AoE, but I don't actually know this video, or the video isn't exactly very explanatory, but this is all pretty well and good, right? 3-hit passive, totally fine, what League of Legends has done before. However, each of Hwei's basic abilities are very different. The first cast of any of his basic ability chooses his subject. After that, you then have to press one of your ability buttons, in this case Q, W, or E, to then actually use an ability. This means that QQ is an ability, QE is an ability, and QW is an ability, as well as WW, WQ, WE, etc. However, they all have a theme. In this case, Q's subject is disaster. This is all intended to be around damage. So if you want damage, you're pressing Q first. Hwei's QQ is Devastating Fire. He fires a fireball that fires out in target direction. It explodes on the first enemy hit or at maximum range to deal magic damage, plus % max health magic damage to all enemies in an AoE. This does mean it's body blockable by minions, but there is an AoE, so you can do the Ziggs or Karma thing where you fire at the back line of casters in order to get the splash onto a champion standing behind the casters or within the wave in general. And this is a general all-purpose damaging spell. It does % max health damage. This means that the poke is always going to be relevant no matter who it hits. But it's also the most predictable, but also the most reliable. You can pretty much press QQ all the time, and this is generally going to work out quite nicely for Hwei. That isn't to say, though, that it's his most damaging ability by far. Hwei's QW is Severing Bolt. He points a long-range devastating bolt at target location that strikes after a delay, dealing magic damage. If you're immobilized or isolated, you take increased damage based on missing health. This is a good way for Hwei to not only put up a ton of poke at long range, but also gives him the ability to execute fleeing minions in a similar vein to Kog'Maw's R. So you can potentially save your QW in order to use this. My question is going to be cooldowns. If Hwei can, for example, just press all of his buttons like a piano and use all of his abilities all at once, or if each of his subjects has a cooldown, so to speak. So if he uses QQ, that his Q ability goes on cooldown, he doesn't get anything else from there. Or if he WWs, he loses out on any of his other W abilities and he has to choose. That is one of my major questions about how this champion specifically is going to work, but we'll find out more once he's on PvE. Hwei's QE is Molten Fissure. He paints a field of exploding volcanic eruptions that creates a lingering lava path in its wake. Every eruption deals magic damage to enemies hit, and if you're in the lava area, you take magic damage per second and are slowed, similar to Rumble's Equalizer, though obviously it fades pretty quickly. This is kind of spooky. Hwei can definitely use this as you approach him, because you will have to be pathing through the explosions, so you'll be taking potentially multiple explosion damage, but also the lingering AoE damage from the path itself, making this pretty effective for Hwei to peel with for himself, but also to potentially catch out enemy champions as he tries to push forward. This is probably most often going to be used for wave clear, however. You can get the minions to catch multiple explosions each, then they're stuck in the field that slows them and deals magic damage over time. This feels like a good choice for Hwei if he just wants to kind of shove out a lane or otherwise catch a bunch of minions in this, because otherwise it's not going to do very much. It looks like it's pretty slow to come out, so you should be able to dodge this most of the time, unless, for example, you're already CC'd or something. Hwei's W is Serenity. This is utility for himself and for allied champions. If you plan on playing Hwei in the support position, this is where you're going to get all of your utility from. Hwei's WQ is Fleeting Current. He paints a current of swift waters in a line for a few seconds that grant movement speed to himself and allies. This is a good thing if you want to set up your Juggernaut friend and say, hey, here's a path, go in, or if you want to save it to peel for yourself and an ally. Hey, let's get out of here. I think this is a pretty self-explanatory ability. It's pretty simple, but most of Hwei's abilities are very simple because he has so many of them. So with that aside, let's go ahead and move on. Hwei's WW is Pool of Reflection. He makes a protective pool at target location that lasts for a few seconds. They gain an immediate shield if you're in the AoE, and it increases in value over a few seconds while you're in the area. This means that you will automatically gain a shield, and if you're able to stay in the area for another duration, that shield will essentially refresh, but of course, if you're able to just stay in it the full time, you'll get the full value of the shield. This means Hwei can use it immediately as a riposte to an incoming enemy damage, and then if you're able to stick around, you can get a double tap on that shield as well. So especially if you have an allied champion that's CC'd and you W under their feet, there's a chance that they'll be able to get multiple shields to maybe survive the burst that's coming through. This is a very interesting ability. The zone is static. This means that if your whole team can stand in the zone, you can technically shield your whole team, but of course that means your whole team is grouped up, and maybe that's not a good idea against someone like, let's say, a Syndra, who's just going to spam her AoE into that area. An interesting ability, when we'll see how this plays out. Finally, Hwei's WE is Stirring Light. He paints 3 swirling lights that circle him for several seconds. His next 3 attacks or spells deal bonus magic damage and grant mana on hit. This is very powerful, potentially. Typically, mages are gated by mana, of course. We know this. And mana restore abilities are few and far between for that reason. Xerath's ability to constantly keep mana up makes him very powerful, counterbalanced by the fact that he's an artillery mage and must step forward to auto-attack you to actually get the mana restore. This just says, hey, Hwei can just pop this, and if he's able to just hit minions, he'll get some mana back. The question for me will be if there is a champion value or a minion value, right? So if Xerath, for example, gets more mana if he auto-attacks a champion, or if it's just a relatively small amount per, but it costs you a fair amount to use. The idea being that if you're not getting the damage on the auto-attacks, that it's not going to be as powerful. Of course, you can use this and then do something like a QQ for a reliable spell hit that then gives you your mana proc because it's on his next spell cast as well. Some interesting things here that you could maybe do with Stirring Lights, but certainly something that is very powerful for a mid lane mage to have access to additional mana regeneration. Finally, Hwei's E is Subject Torment. This is all about CC and controlling enemies. Hwei's EQ is Grim Visage. He launches a face that strikes the first enemy hit, dealing magic damage and causing them to flee for a brief duration. This is Fiddlestick's Q. It's Fiddlestick's Q without the double damage if they're already terrified, because Hwei can't terrify you twice, but suffice to say, still very powerful. This is also not targeted, meaning that it can miss. It can be body blocked by a hero minion or by a frontliner, for example. But this is a good way for Hwei to peel for himself, or potentially to set up for something like, let's say, a WQ, because then you are terrified, you can't move potentially fast enough to dodge the incoming meteor, right? Like, there are some things that I could see this ability being very useful for, though of course the Terrify duration is not particularly long to account for that. Hwei's EW is Gaze of the Abyss. He paints an abyssal eye at target location that grants vision and locks onto the nearest visible enemy champion, and then after a delay, the eye fires at the locked on champion, rooting the first enemy in its path for a few seconds and dealing magic damage to them. This means that even if the eye locks onto you, if you're able to move behind a frontliner, potentially that frontliner takes the damage instead, so there is some degree of counterplay to this. This does give vision in the area effect as well, so Hwei can use it to just scout. He can just throw it out and just get vision in a bush, for example, even if it doesn't actually do anything from there. This is generally a very powerful ability, I think, overall. It doesn't feel like there's that much time before it fires, so I don't know how easy it will be in practice to actually intercept this for an allied champion, but of course there is the delay, there is the fact that there is a travel time, so potentially there's something that you can do there, but the fact that it's a root as well makes this, I think, very powerful. You can then combo this with something like a QE for the AoE damage, because once the root lands, they won't be able to dodge on the explosions or the burning AoE afterwards. Like, this seems like it will be very, very powerful, and this is just one of 10 abilities he has. Kinda crazy. Finally, moving on to Hwei's EE, which is Crushing Maw. He paints crushing jaws that deal magic damage to enemies hit and pulls them towards the center, slowing them by a set amount that quickly decays, right? Finally found a home for their Sand Hands ultimate that I know at least they initially trialed out on Azir so many years ago. This is a very powerful ability. If you're able to land this and the delay does not look particularly long, this is a bunch of CC by pulling champions in towards the center. This then means that they're clumped up for something like a QQ in order to splash all that damage onto them, or maybe even a WQ, depending on how long the slow lasts, especially later ranks. Very powerful indeed, especially as a setup tool to allow you to get a bunch of damage off onto enemy champions. That said, you have to choose between one of his E abilities. I'm assuming that there is a per subject cooldown, so if you use an E ability that your E goes on cooldown, you can't use any other E abilities until it comes back up. That's how I'm assuming it works. We don't actually know yet. But if that is so, then I think Hwei is probably okay. Even if he gets the pull in, he can then go for the QQ, but you do have the ability to potentially move out of the way. Not less because Hwei can potentially sidestep out of it, but a very powerful ability, I think, overall, especially if you're able to combo other CC into this, right? If you have another ally like Ashland's an Enchanted Crystal Arrow, then you're able to set up your QE, then you use EE to keep people in the area of effect, right? Like, that's kind of spooky. There are a lot of things that Hwei is going to be able to combo with and do, but I think this ability is one of his strongest alongside his EW. Finally, Hwei has an ultimate. It wasn't enough for him to have 9 basic abilities. He's also got an ult. This is called Spiraling Despair. He launches a vision of pure despair that sticks to an enemy champion for a few seconds. The vision expands and overwhelms all enemy it touches, dealing magic damage per second. Enemies within the zone are afflicted with stacks of despair over time, and each stack of despair afflicts a stacking percentage slow. Upon completion, the vision shatters, dealing magic damage. This is a very terrifying ability as well. Not only does this give Hwei a ton of damage to the main target, they will, of course, take all of the magic damage per second in addition to the final explosion because it sticks to them, so it doesn't sound like they can move out of the area of effect. It says just a few seconds, but my assumption is that that's for the full duration. But most importantly, it's also terrifying for their team. This isolates an enemy team member by a tremendous margin. Yeah, you can stand next to your ally who's been hit with a Spiraling Despair, but you'll be taking the magic damage per second as well, you'll be eating the slow, and then you'll also be eating the explosion at the end. This is very powerful. My assumption, of course, is that this is a skill shot. It may be a targeted ability, but I feel like it would be too strong as a targeted ability, so my assumption is that this is going to be a skill shot that Hwei fires, and if it misses, it does nothing. That, I think, would make it very fair. It seems like a relatively slow-moving ability, so if you do fire this out, you probably need to combo it in with one of your other abilities or with an ally's ability, but otherwise, this is very good. This is going to isolate that target for a substantial period of time. If they're not isolated, their whole team is going to be taking a ton of magic damage. I can see this being very, very spooky, and on top of everything else that Hwei already has, this helps you line up a WQ, for example. This helps you line up an EE. You could potentially even do a Q or an EQ if you really want to in order to set this up afterwards. Like, there's a lot that this is doing for Hwei on top of all of the other things that he's able to do. In general, Hwei seems very good, but I will state this as a conditional. I think Hwei is going to be very powerful, but Hwei is going to suck in the hands of people who do not know what they are doing on him. I do think, for example, if the only thing you're doing are using his spam buttons, so if all you're doing is QQ, WW, EE, I think probably you will be relatively okay on Hwei. We talked about the EE into QQ combo, for example. You have your WW for a shield. I think that as a mid laner, especially, it's probably enough for you to get a lot of value in a similar vein to someone like Orianna or Karma played in the mid lane. I think generally you're going to be okay in those scenarios. But certainly, Hwei has a million things he can do, and as a result, I think that there is going to be a ton of stuff that very good Hwei players will do. And as a result, I think balancing him is going to be a nightmare. Aphelios, for example, seems complicated off the cuff. He has 5 different weapons, they all have their own ability, they all combo with each other in different ways, but honestly, having played Aphelios a few times now, I feel like generally he's not actually that complicated. All you really have to know is what abilities apply his offhand weapons marks, and what that means for you, and like what weapon do you have, what does your ultimate do when you have that weapon equipped. It's complicated for sure, but generally it feels like there's a lot that you can kind of cut out and say, yeah, I don't care about that. Hwei has 9 basic abilities. Plus his passive, don't forget that, that's the bonus damage if you hit someone with 2 abilities, plus the ultimate. There's a lot that Hwei is going in with, and as a result, he is going to be the kind of champion that you are committing to playing a ton. You are going to be sitting here playing this champion for hours before even generally knowing what all of your button combinations do, and then remembering them in the middle of a fight will be very difficult. Ryze is another champion who's quote-unquote combo oriented, but you don't really have to know Ryze combos. They flow pretty well, they generally make a lot of sense. Hwei combos, on the other hand, you are going to need to read guides. You are going to need to practice this so you have your muscle memory down. You are going to need to be paying attention to when you pressed a button, what button it was, and then selecting from there. There's a lot at play here. It's hard for me to give an initial impression of Hwei even just because of how much stuff he does. He has lots of powerful AoE crowd control abilities, he has lots of powerful AoE damage abilities, he has utility as well, so even in a game that Hwei is behind in, he will be doing quite effectively. And most of his abilities, I feel, aren't necessarily very telegraphed, right? I think EE, for example, is maybe a little telegraphed. I think EW is, again, maybe a little telegraphed. Obviously, QE is relatively telegraphed. This is going to be pretty easy to dodge. There will be a haymaker if it does land. But in general, having the flexibility to choose, I want an artillery strike. I need a close range AoE ability. I want to go for the big haymaker ability. I have lots of supportive tools with a movement speed bonus, a shield zone, mana restore for myself, so even if I'm mid lane, my W still matters to me. Like, there's a lot that's going to happen. My assumption, of course, is that you're going to rank up your individual subjects. So if you go for the damage subject, that ranks up all of your damaging abilities at the same time. As a result, if you're like mid lane Hwei, you're probably going to go for a W max last, and max probably QE would be my assumption. If you're support Hwei, Riot have said they want him to be playable in the support position, that they will then, you'll probably max W into E. There's a lot at play here. And as a result, again, it's hard for me to get a grip on Hwei. My personal assumption is he will be a balanced nightmare, especially at the highest levels of play. I think in casual play, Hwei will be bad basically forever. In a similar fashion to champions like Azir or Ryze or Kalista that are just very high input skill mastery. You have to be very good at the champions to get the most out of them. And Riot have even said we're balancing them for pro play alone. Hwei feels like the kind of champion that will be balanced for pro play alone. I think you can't put this many tools on a champion and have them be easy to balance. That's not to say that Riot couldn't balance Hwei, but I certainly think he will be very difficult. I think the pros will be very good at him, and people who pick up Hwei for the first time will not be particularly good. I think he will be the kind of champion that, again, if you really love him and love his aesthetic and want to get good at him, you will be committing lots of time and energy into him. And I think that if you have a casual relationship with Hwei, it's never going to go anywhere. He's going to demand a lot more of your attention than before. I like his particle effects. I think he looks very much so the Archmage, and I like that Riot opted in for less of a classic stereotypical mage archetype by saying he has spell books, and the spell books tell him what he's actually casting. Instead, we go for his subjects, and he paints his abilities out. I think that's kind of fun. I do think the subjects also give you a good grasp of generally what you're expecting to do, so even if you're spamming, as long as I know I pressed Q, I know whatever I do is going to be damage focused. If I'm pressing E, I know whatever I do is going to be utility focused, mostly CC focused. So, like, in that regard, I think it works well to help teach you what Hwei does. But I think that good Hweis are going to be very, very, very good, and they will look unstoppable. Support Hwei, I think, generally looks playable. It's going to depend on how powerful his WW shield is for me, personally. I think if it's very good, he'll be playable in the support position. I think if it's mediocre at best, I think he will not be playable at support position. I think he has a lot of utility that's going to make him nice on top of the other like things he can do with his W abilities, but it won't be like impressive enough for me to say, yeah, support Hwei is good. But if the shield is good, then support Hwei will totally be playable. I don't think this champion necessarily has the ability to jungle. I don't think he necessarily has the ability to play top lane or in the support role, or in the bot lane carry role. But generally, I think that Hwei looks like a very promising mid laner if you're able to take the time and energy to invest into him. Right, I haven't talked much about his lore yet, but from what we do know, he had a run-in with Jhin, who basically murdered everyone who he was working with, and Jhin wasn't a student with him, but he was either spared or by Jhin or drove off Jhin or something along those lines, and as a result he survived but also had an experience with someone who understands his art in the first place. Hwei very much so was told to constrain his emotions, not paint exactly what he's feeling, but Jhin sort of said, but I get you, I get what your art is. And so it's a very interesting, I think, relationship that those two will have with each other, but certainly that is the place where they started. So my theory about Hwei and Jhin being students together was wrong, but I think at the end of the day that there is still that connection there that I do quite like for them. We also know he's from Ionia, of course, and that's why he's got all this magic going on, and he draws from his own experiences to cast his spells, which I think is very interesting. As with most champions that Riot have released, don't know how much more that they're going to do with Hwei, but I certainly think it's a good start for the character, at least. The abilities, he's good. I think he's going to be very good if you can even remotely do things. And this was me making assumptions about how some of his abilities work, usually making the assumption that they're weaker. For example, I'm assuming Signature of the Visionary doesn't stick to the target. I'm assuming his ultimate is not point and click. If the Signature sticks and his ultimate is point and click, I don't want to say Champ's busted. I haven't gotten to play with him yet, but Champ's probably busted. If those aren't true, he's probably more okay. If he's extremely squishy, he might be okay, because you might be able to blow him up before he can get off any of his big value. And there are like other comps that you could play against him. I think team fighting is where he's going to shine. I think if you're playing 131, for example, he's not going to be particularly good. But in general, I think Hwei looks very, very promising, and I am interested to try him out, if not excited. But let me know what you think of Hwei down in the comment section below. If you agree with me that he seems completely broken, if you think he's another 200 years champion, spoiler alert, he is. Anything, all that down in the description below, or down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.